Marcus Williams stood in shackles before the court, just another homeless veteran arrested for vagrancy. But when the judge read his full name aloud, her face went pale and her gavel dropped. What happened next would leave everyone speechless. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video and comment on where you're watching from. Let's get started. Marcus Washington pulled his threadbare military jacket tighter around his shoulders as the December wind cut through the underpass he called home. 15 years after serving his country with distinction in Afghanistan, he found himself living on the streets of Westfield, a mid-sized city where he'd once been a high school football star. The same town that had cheered his name now averted its eyes when he asked for spare change. The Medal of Honor he'd earned saving his unit from an ambush stayed wrapped in a plastic bag inside his backpack, along with discharge papers and faded photographs of a life that seemed to belong to someone else. His hands, once steady enough to disarm explosives under fire, now trembled constantly, partly from the cold, partly from the PTSD that had derailed his life after returning home. "Move along, Washington. Can't stay here tonight." Officer Brennan's voice carried the practiced indifference of a man who'd repeated the same phrase countless times. Marcus looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes. "Evening, officer. Weather report says it's dropping to 20 degrees tonight. Shelter's full already." "Not my problem," Brennan replied, his partner Officer Reynolds standing silently behind him, a rookie still uncomfortable with these interactions. "Downtown Business Association's been complaining again. Got orders to clear this area." Marcus nodded, slowly gathering his few possessions. He knew the routine. This dance of displacement had become as familiar as the military drills he once performed. He'd find another spot for tonight, another temporary refuge until someone else decided he was unsightly or unwanted. "Any chance you could look the other way until morning?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying no real hope, just a dignity that refused to completely surrender. Brennan's radio crackled to life before he could answer. "All units in the vicinity of Westfield Plaza, possible 1031 in progress, suspect described as black male, approximately 50 years old, wearing military-style clothing." Marcus saw Brennan's expression shift, the officer's eyes narrowing as they reassessed him. "Stand up slowly," Brennan ordered, his hand moving to his weapon. "What's happening?" Marcus asked, confusion evident in his voice. "Someone matching your description just robbed the convenience store 3 blocks from here," Reynolds explained, his younger voice carrying a trace of uncertainty. "That wasn't me. I've been right here all evening," Marcus protested, rising carefully to his feet, mindful of Brennan's hand hovering near his holster. "Sure," Brennan replied, sarcasm dripping from the word. "Turn around, hands against the wall." Marcus complied, the familiar humiliation washing over him. How many times had this happened since he'd been on the streets? Being black and homeless meant perpetually fitting someone's description of a suspect. "I have identification in my backpack," Marcus said calmly. "Military ID, Veterans Affairs card." "Shut up," Brennan snapped, roughly patting him down while Reynolds watched nervously. "Well, what's this?" Brennan's voice carried theatrical triumph as he pulled a pocket knife from Marcus's jacket. 3-inch blade. Legal to carry," Marcus stated flatly. "Looks like a dangerous weapon to me," Brennan replied, exchanging a meaningful glance with Reynolds, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. "And what's this?" He pulled out a $20 bill from another pocket. "Kind woman gave me that earlier." "For food," Marcus explained, maintaining his composure despite the rising sense of dread. He'd seen this scenario unfold before, not just with him, but with others like him. "Convenient," Brennan remarked, cuffing Marcus's wrists behind his back. "Matches what was stolen from the register." "Check the cameras at the store," Marcus suggested, his military training still evident in how he remained strategic even when threatened. They'll show I wasn't there." "Oh, we'll check everything," Brennan assured him, but the slight smile betrayed his lack of interest in verification. "Reynolds, read him his rights." The younger officer stepped forward, reciting the Miranda warning with mechanical precision while avoiding eye contact with Marcus. As they led him to the patrol car, Marcus caught a glimpse of his few possessions scattered beneath the underpass. His life reduced to a sleeping bag, backpack, and plastic bags. He wondered if anything would still be there if he ever made it back. The processing at the police station followed a script Marcus had experienced before. Fingerprinting, mugshots, perfunctory questions met with disinterest. What differed this time was the charge: armed robbery rather than the usual trespassing or disturbing the peace. Something more serious, something that couldn't be dismissed with a night in the drunk tank. "I'm telling you, check the store cameras," Marcus repeated to the booking officer, who barely looked up from his computer. "Save it for your public defender," the officer replied. Marcus spent the night in a holding cell, the concrete bench a poor substitute even for the hard ground beneath the underpass. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the sounds of other desperate souls cycling through the system. The drunk tank emptying and filling again, the shouting, the pleas, the occasional wail of someone in genuine crisis. Morning brought a brief appearance before a magistrate who set bail at an amount Marcus couldn't possibly afford. The public defender assigned to him, a harried woman named Karen Daniels, barely had time to flip through his file before his case was called. "Mr. Washington, the charges against you are serious," she whispered as they stood before the bench. "But something doesn't add up." The store owner gave a description that's pretty generic, and the $20 they found on you hardly constitutes evidence of a robbery where supposedly hundreds were taken. "I wasn't there," Marcus replied simply. "I believe you," she said, surprising him. "But Officer Brennan's report paints a different picture. Says you were belligerent and uncooperative, that you matched the description perfectly, and were found in possession of what appeared to be proceeds from the crime." Marcus felt a familiar weariness settle over him. "Been down this road before." "I'll request the security footage," Daniels promised. "If you weren't there, that should clear things up." But when they met again 3 days later in the visitation room of the county jail, her expression told him everything before she spoke. "The store claims their security system malfunctioned that night. No footage available." Marcus closed his eyes briefly. "Convenient." "Very," she agreed, a flash of anger crossing her features. "Mr. Washington, your case has been assigned to Judge Robert Marshall's courtroom. Trial date is set for next week." She hesitated. "Do you know Judge Marshall?" Marcus shook his head. "Been away from Westfield too long. Names don't mean much to me anymore." Daniels studied him. "He's tough but fair, old school. Served in the military himself, from what I hear." "Military service doesn't automatically make someone fair," Marcus observed quietly. "No," she conceded, "but it might mean he'll actually listen to your side of the story." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "There's something else. Officer Brennan has a history, complaints of excessive force, racial profiling. Nothing that stuck, but patterns emerge. I'm going to dig deeper." For the first time since his arrest, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Not much, just enough to notice its presence like a match struck in darkness. The days passed slowly in the county jail. Marcus kept to himself, the discipline of his military years helping him navigate the unwritten rules that governed life inside. He thought often of his backpack, wondering if someone had claimed it yet, if his medal and photographs were lost forever, the last tangible connections to who he had been before the streets claimed him. His thoughts drifted to Judge Robert Marshall, a name that stirred something in his memory, though he couldn't place it. Perhaps from his youth in Westfield, before deployment changed everything. Or maybe from his military years. So many names, so many faces blurred by time and trauma. The morning of his trial arrived with a county-issued suit that hung loosely on his frame. Years of inconsistent meals and hard living had whittled him down from the powerful soldier he once was. Still, as he straightened his posture and lifted his chin, flashes of Lieutenant Marcus Washington, decorated combat veteran, emerged through the worn facade of the homeless man he'd become. "Ready?" Daniels asked, meeting him in the holding area outside the courtroom. "As I'll ever be," Marcus replied, his voice finding strength he hadn't accessed in years. "Remember what we discussed: your military service, your struggles with PTSD, the lack of support systems. These aren't excuses, but context. Judge Marshall needs to understand who you really are." Marcus nodded, though privately he wondered if anyone could truly see beyond the homeless man in borrowed clothes. The system had a way of reducing people to their current circumstances, erasing their histories and humanity. The bailiff appeared at the door. "Court is in session. Judge Marshall presiding." As Marcus rose to enter the courtroom, he felt a strange sensation. Not quite déjà vu, but something similar. A memory trying to surface. A connection he couldn't quite grasp. Something about the name Marshall that tugged at his consciousness. "All rise," the bailiff called as they entered the courtroom. And as Judge Robert Marshall took the bench, Marcus Washington finally remembered where he had heard that name before. Judge Robert Marshall had aged well. His once dark hair was now silver at the temples, lending him an air of distinguished authority. His shoulders remained broad beneath his black robe, his posture military straight, a habit from his years of service that had never left him. The gavel in his hand looked almost delicate compared to his substantial fingers. As the judge's eyes scanned the courtroom, they paused briefly on Marcus. A flicker of something, confusion, then recognition, passed across his features before his professional mask returned. "Commonwealth versus Marcus Washington," Judge Marshall announced, his deep voice filling the courtroom. "Charges of armed robbery, resisting arrest, and possession of a dangerous weapon." Marcus stood straighter, memories flooding back. Captain Robert Marshall, Echo Company, 3rd Battalion, Afghanistan, 2008. The young officer who had joined their unit 6 months before the ambush that earned Marcus his medal. The same Robert Marshall whose life Marcus had saved. "Your Honor," Daniels began, "we request these charges be dismissed. The prosecution has no evidence beyond Officer Brennan's report, which contradicts the store owner's statement. The alleged security footage is conveniently missing, and the supposed weapon is a legal pocket knife." The prosecutor, a sharp-featured woman named Collins, countered immediately. "Your Honor, Officer Brennan is a decorated member of the force. His testimony alone is sufficient to establish probable cause. The defendant was found with cash matching the amount taken and a knife that could certainly be used as a weapon." Judge Marshall's eyes remained fixed on Marcus throughout this exchange, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Daniels, approach the bench. Ms. Collins, you as well." As the attorneys stepped forward, Judge Marshall lowered his voice. "I need to disclose something. I believe I may know the defendant from my military service." Collins' eyebrows shot up. "Your Honor, if there's a conflict of interest—" "I'm not certain yet," Marshall interrupted. "It's been many years, and I want to verify before making any decisions about recusal." Daniels glanced back at Marcus, who stood at attention, his military bearing unmistakable despite his circumstances. "Your Honor, how would this affect the proceedings?" "That remains to be determined," Marshall replied. "We'll take a 15-minute recess. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Washington to my chambers." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom as the judge stood and exited. Marcus felt a mixture of hope and apprehension as the bailiff led him through a side door and down a corridor to the judge's private office. Judge Marshall was standing at the window when Marcus entered, his back to the door, hands clasped behind him. Another military habit. The bailiff positioned himself just inside the doorway. "That will be all, Carl," Marshall said without turning. "Wait outside, please." When they were alone, Marshall finally turned to face Marcus. Up close, the years were more visible on his face, lines carved by stress and responsibility, a small scar near his right eye that hadn't been there in Afghanistan. "Lieutenant Washington," Marshall said, the military rank sounding strange after so many years. "Not for a long time, sir," Marcus replied, his voice finding its former strength. "It's just Marcus now." Marshall gestured to a chair. "Please sit." Marcus remained standing. "I prefer to stand if it's all the same." A hint of a smile touched Marshall's lips. "Some habits never leave us." He studied Marcus carefully. "Echo Company, the Korangal Valley. You pulled me and 3 others out of a burning Humvee after the IED hit." "Yes, sir." "You received the Medal of Honor." Marcus nodded once, a sharp military acknowledgement. "And now you're in my courtroom charged with armed robbery." Marshall's tone wasn't accusatory, merely stating facts. "What happened to you, Lieutenant?" The question contained multitudes. What happened in the years between medals and homelessness? Between honor and accusations? Between service and suffering? "Life, sir," Marcus answered simply. "Came home with more ghosts than I could handle. VA prescribed pills that made things worse. Lost my apartment, then my job. Been on the streets for about 7 years now." Marshall's jaw tightened. "And these charges?" "False, sir. I was under the underpass when Officer Brennan moved me along. Then the call came in about the robbery. Suddenly I matched the description. The knife? Legal pocket knife. For protection and practical use. You know how it is on deployment. A blade becomes an extension of your hand. Hard habit to break." Marshall nodded, understanding evident in his eyes. "And the money?" "Woman gave it to me earlier that day. Said to get myself a hot meal." Silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Marshall moved to his desk and sank into his chair, suddenly looking tired. "I should recuse myself," he said finally. "Clear conflict of interest." "With respect, sir, who would take the case?" Marcus asked. "Another judge who sees a homeless black man with a record of minor offenses? Someone who'd take Officer Brennan's word as gospel?" Marshall's eyes sharpened. "You're suggesting I'd be more fair because I know you?" "I'm suggesting you'd see me as a man, not just a case number. Someone with a past that includes more than arrests." The judge steepled his fingers, considering. "The ethical implications are problematic." "So is an innocent man going to prison," Marcus countered. Marshall stood again, military bearing reasserting itself. "I can't discuss the specifics of your case without both attorneys present. That would be improper." He paused. "But I can ensure the proceedings are fair." "That's all I'm asking for, sir. A fair chance." The judge pressed a button on his desk. "Carl, please escort Mr. Washington back to the courtroom. We're about to resume." As the bailiff led him out, Marcus felt the weight of Marshall's gaze on his back, measuring, assessing, perhaps even remembering the young lieutenant who had once risked everything to save his captain's life. When court resumed, Judge Marshall's demeanor had shifted subtly. His eyes were more focused, his questions more pointed. "Ms. Collins," he addressed the prosecutor, "I understand Officer Brennan is your primary witness?" "Yes, Your Honor. His testimony is central to our case." "And the store owner? Will he be testifying?" Collins shifted uncomfortably. "We haven't been able to secure his testimony. Language barriers have complicated matters." "I see," Marshall replied, his tone neutral but his eyes sharp. "And the security footage?" "As I've stated, the system malfunctioned that evening." "How convenient," Marshall remarked. causing the prosecutor to stiffen. Ms. Daniels, your motion to dismiss is denied at this time. However, I'm ordering the prosecution to produce the store owner as a witness. This court needs to hear directly from the alleged victim. Collins began to protest, but Marshall cut her off with a raised hand. Additionally, I want the maintenance records for the security system. If it malfunctioned, someone must have reported and repaired it. Your Honor, Collins tried again, these requests place an undue burden on the prosecution. On the contrary, Ms. Collins, they place a due burden on the prosecution to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt. Isn't that the standard we uphold in this courtroom? Daniels was struggling to hide her surprise at this turn of events. Marcus maintained his composure, though a flicker of hope kindled in his chest. Trial is scheduled to begin next Monday, Marshall announced. Ms. Collins, I expect your witness and those maintenance records by then. Bail is reduced to personal recognizance. The prosecutor's mouth fell open. Your Honor, the defendant has no fixed address. He's a flight risk. Is he? Marshall's gaze shifted to Marcus. Mr. Washington, if released, do you intend to flee this jurisdiction? No, sir, Marcus replied firmly. I don't run from fights I can win. Marshall almost smiled at the military bravado in those words. So noted. Defendant is released on his own recognizance. Court is adjourned until Monday. As the gavel fell, Marcus could hardly process what had just happened. After weeks in county lockup, he was being released. Judge Marshall had given him a fighting chance, perhaps out of a sense of debt, perhaps from a soldier's understanding of another soldier's honor, or perhaps simply because justice demanded it. Whatever the reason, Marcus Washington was walking out of the courtroom a free man, at least temporarily. As he passed the bench, his eyes met Marshall's in a moment of silent acknowledgement. Two veterans who understood that some bonds forged in combat never truly break, even when life takes them in wildly different directions. Freedom felt strange to Marcus after weeks in county lockup. The setting sun painted Westfield's buildings in golden light as he stood on the courthouse steps, unsure where to go. His underpass would be claimed by someone else by now. His few possessions were likely long gone. Marcus. Karen Daniels hurried down the steps behind him, briefcase clutched against her chest. Wait. He turned, surprised by the concern in her voice. Public defenders rarely had time for such personal attention. You need a place to stay, she said, catching her breath. Judge Marshall's decision caught everyone off guard. I wasn't prepared to help with housing. I'll manage, Marcus replied, his eyes already scanning the streets, calculating walking distances to shelters that might have space. The shelters will be full by now. Daniels dug through her purse and pulled out a business card, scribbling on the back. This is a motel on 5th Street. Not fancy, but clean. I've called ahead and paid for 3 nights. She pressed $60 into his hand. For food. Marcus stared at the money, pride warring with necessity. Ms. Daniels. Karen, she corrected. And before you refuse, remember you need to be presentable in court on Monday. That means shower, clean clothes, meals. Her expression softened. This isn't charity, Marcus. It's strategy. Strategy. The word resonated with his military mindset. He nodded once and accepted the card. I'll get your backpack, she added. It's in police evidence. Should have it tomorrow. Hope flared in his chest. It's still there? Logged and sealed, I checked. She glanced at her watch. I have to run. Meeting at my son's school. But call me if you need anything. My cell's on the card. As she hurried away, Marcus felt momentarily unmoored. The streets of Westfield had changed during his incarceration. Or perhaps he was seeing them differently now, with the possibility of justice on the horizon. He began walking toward 5th Street, hyper-aware of passers-by's reactions. Some still averted their eyes, conditioned to ignore the homeless. Others stared openly, perhaps recognizing him from local news coverage of his arrest. The story had made headlines. Homeless veteran charged in armed robbery. The update, judge releases accused robber on own recognizance, would likely stir even more attention. The motel was exactly as Karen had described, clean but basic. The desk clerk handed him a key without comment, though his eyes lingered on Marcus's county-issued clothing. The room itself was a luxury compared to his recent accommodations. A real bed, private bathroom, even a small television. Marcus showered first, standing under the hot water until his skin prickled, washing away weeks of institutional grime. The face in the mirror afterward was almost unfamiliar, cleaner, somehow younger despite the gray in his beard. After eating half a sandwich from the deli across the street, saving the rest for later, old habits of rationing die hard, he settled on the bed and turned on the local news. Controversy in the courtroom today, the anchor announced, as Judge Robert Marshall dramatically reduced bail for a homeless man accused of armed robbery. Sources close to the case suggest a potential conflict of interest, as Judge Marshall and defendant Marcus Washington may have served together in the military. The district attorney's office declined to comment on whether they'll seek the judge's recusal. Marcus switched off the television, troubled by the implications. Marshall had risked his reputation by not immediately stepping away from the case. The gesture wasn't lost on Marcus. Sleep came uneasily that night, his body too accustomed to vigilance for the luxury of deep rest. By dawn he was awake and restless, pacing the small room like a caged animal. He needed to move, to feel useful. Near the motel he found a small diner just opening for the day. The owner, an older woman named Maggie, looked him over with shrewd eyes as he ordered coffee. "You're him, aren't you? The veteran from the news?" Marcus tensed, preparing for judgment or rejection. Instead, she slid a full breakfast in front of him. "On the house. My son served in Iraq. He came home different too." The simple act of kindness nearly undid him. "Thank you, ma'am. You staying at the Westfield Inn?" When he nodded, she continued, "Stop by tomorrow if you need another meal. And ignore the vultures. This town loves drama more than it loves truth." Marcus spent the day reacquainting himself with Westfield, mapping routes between the motel, courthouse, and Karen's office. The simple act of navigation, assessing terrain, noting landmarks, settled his military mind. He was establishing a base of operations, preparing for the battle ahead. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Brennan was facing his own reckoning. "What the hell happened in that courtroom?" Lieutenant Cooper demanded, slamming Brennan's arrest report on his desk. "Judge Marshall practically accused you of fabricating evidence." Brennan maintained his composure. "Marshall's compromised. He knows the perp from the military." "Which you failed to discover during your investigation," Cooper shot back. "Basic background would have flagged that connection." "Washington's just another homeless junkie. How was I supposed to know he had history with the judge?" Cooper's expression hardened. "He's a Medal of Honor recipient, you idiot. His name is in the congressional record." He rubbed his temples. "The DA's office is scrambling. They need the store owner to corroborate your story, but apparently Mr. Patel is now saying he never got a clear look at the robber." Brennan shifted uncomfortably. He was confused that night, traumatized. "Or you decided a homeless black veteran made a convenient suspect." Cooper leaned forward. "Tell me now if this case is going to blow up in our faces. The department can't afford another excessive force or racial profiling scandal." "The case is solid," Brennan insisted, though sweat beaded along his hairline. "Washington was in the area, had cash that matched the amount taken, and carried a weapon." "A legal pocket knife," Cooper corrected, "and $20. Hardly the take from an armed robbery." He stood, towering over Brennan. "Fix this. Get Patel on board. Find that security footage. Because if this case falls apart, you're taking the fall, not the department." As Brennan left, seething with resentment, Karen Daniels was in her cluttered office, spreading case files across her desk. Marcus Washington's military records painted a picture of exceptional service. Citations for bravery, perfect performance evaluations, and the Medal of Honor citation describing how he'd rescued 4 men, including Captain Robert Marshall, from a burning vehicle while under enemy fire. The contrast with his post-military life was stark. His struggles began almost immediately upon return: a PTSD diagnosis, prescriptions for medications with serious side effects, appointments at understaffed VA facilities. Then came the downward spiral: job loss, eviction, and eventually, the streets. His arrest record showed minor infractions typical of homelessness: trespassing, public intoxication early on, though none recently, suggesting he'd gotten sober despite his circumstances. Nothing violent, nothing that indicated he would suddenly escalate to armed robbery. Karen's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Ms. Daniels? This is Judge Marshall's clerk. The judge would like to see you and Ms. Collins in his chambers tomorrow at 9 a.m. After confirming she'd be there, Karen returned to her files with renewed urgency. Whatever Marshall wanted to discuss, she needed to be prepared. Back at the motel, Marcus received his own message, a voicemail from Karen saying she'd recovered his backpack and would bring it tomorrow. Relief washed over him. Those photographs and his medal were his last connections to his former self, tangible proof that Lieutenant Marcus Washington had once existed. That evening, as darkness fell, Marcus stood at his motel window, watching the street below. A police cruiser drove by slowly, and though he couldn't see the driver clearly, he felt certain it was Brennan, checking if he'd fled. Marcus didn't move from the window, allowing himself to be seen. He wouldn't hide, wouldn't run. That wasn't who he was, not as a soldier, and not now. Across town, in his spacious home in Westfield's most prestigious neighborhood, Judge Robert Marshall sat in his study, a glass of bourbon in one hand and an old photograph in the other. The picture showed a younger version of himself standing with several soldiers against a dusty Afghan landscape. Lieutenant Marcus Washington stood at his side, both men smiling despite the grime and exhaustion evident on their faces. The memories of that day in the Korangal Valley remained vivid: the deafening explosion, the searing heat of the flames, the certainty that he was about to die. Then Washington appearing through the smoke, ignoring the ongoing gunfire to drag him and the others to safety. Marshall had testified for Washington's Medal of Honor, had attended the ceremony, had promised to stay in touch. But life happened. Marshall returned home to his law practice, then his judgeship. Washington returned to what? A system that failed him at every turn, apparently. Marshall set down his glass and picked up his phone, dialing a number few people had access to. "This is Judge Marshall. I need a favor, old friend. Completely off the record." The voice on the other end responded warmly. "Anything for you, Rob. Name it." "I need everything you can find on an Officer Thomas Brennan of the Westfield PD. Complaints, commendations, pattern of arrests, everything." "Sounds serious." "It is," Marshall confirmed. "And James? This needs to be clean, by the book. What I'm looking for has to be admissible if necessary." "Understood. I'll have it to you by morning." Marshall ended the call and returned to the photograph. The decision not to immediately recuse himself would raise eyebrows, perhaps even prompt formal complaints. But sometimes justice required walking a fine ethical line. He owed Washington his life. He wouldn't stand by and watch as an innocent man, a hero, was sacrificed to protect a corrupt officer's reputation. The morning sun glinted off the courthouse's granite facade as Karen Daniels climbed the steps, Marcus's backpack slung over her shoulder. Its weight seemed disproportionate to its size, perhaps because she understood what it contained. Not just possessions, but the remnants of a man's identity. In Judge Marshall's chambers, Prosecutor Collins was already seated, her posture rigid with displeasure. Judge Marshall stood near the window, his back military straight, hands clasped behind him. "Ms. Daniels, thank you for joining us," Marshall said, gesturing to an empty chair. "I've asked you both here to address concerns about this case before we proceed to trial." Collins wasted no time. "Your Honor, with all due respect, the defense motion for your recusal should be heard first. The conflict of interest is clear." Marshall raised an eyebrow. "I don't recall seeing such a motion, Ms. Collins." "The district attorney's office is preparing it now." "Interesting timing," Marshall noted, "especially considering the prosecution's case appears to be built entirely on Officer Brennan's testimony." Collins bristled. "We have physical evidence." $20 and a pocket knife," Karen interjected. "Hardly conclusive." Marshall held up a hand. "I've reviewed the case file thoroughly. The concerns are numerous, not least the missing security footage and the store owner's apparent reluctance to testify." "Mr. Patel is cooperating fully," Collins insisted. "Is he?" Marshall removed a folder from his desk. "Because I received this affidavit from Mr. Patel yesterday evening, delivered by my clerk who speaks Hindi. In it, he states that Officer Brennan pressured him to identify a suspect he never clearly saw, and that when he mentioned the security system was functional, Brennan told him not to worry about the footage." Collins's face paled. "I was not aware—" "That's becoming increasingly clear," Marshall interrupted. "Ms. Collins, you're an experienced prosecutor. I've always known you to be thorough and ethical. So I must ask, did you personally speak with Mr. Patel before bringing charges?" "I received Officer Brennan's report and witness statement." "But you didn't interview the alleged victim yourself?" Collins's silence was answer enough. Marshall continued, "I'm not recusing myself, Ms. Collins. Not yet. Because what concerns me more than any potential conflict is the possibility that an innocent man was charged based on an officer's potentially falsified report." He handed copies of the affidavit to both attorneys. "I'm ordering an immediate evidentiary hearing. Mr. Patel will testify under oath about what he saw or didn't see that night. And I want that security footage located." "Your Honor," Collins began, "if you're suggesting Officer Brennan—" "I'm not suggesting anything, Counselor. I'm demanding that justice be properly served in my courtroom." Marshall's voice carried the unmistakable authority of both judge and former military officer. "Hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. If the prosecution cannot produce sufficient evidence to proceed, I will dismiss the charges." As Karen left the chambers, she found Marcus waiting in the corridor, standing at parade rest, a military habit that had clearly never left him. "Your backpack," she said, handing it over. Marcus accepted it with reverence, his fingers immediately checking the side pocket where his most precious possessions were kept. Relief washed over his face when he confirmed they were still there. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Didn't think I'd see this again." "Good news," Karen continued. "Judge Marshall ordered an evidentiary hearing for tomorrow. He has an affidavit from Mr. Patel that contradicts Officer Brennan's report." Marcus's eyes widened. "The store owner is telling the truth?" "Apparently, Brennan pressured him to identify a suspect he never clearly saw." Karen checked her watch. "I need to prepare for the hearing. Can you meet me at my office at 3?" After she hurried away, Marcus found a quiet bench in the courthouse corridor, carefully opening his backpack. Everything was still there: his VA paperwork, the worn clothing, the toothbrush he'd managed to keep through years on the streets. But it was the plastic bag in the side pocket that mattered most. With careful fingers, he removed it, extracting the Medal of Honor, still in its case. The weight of it in his palm transported him back to the ceremony. The president's words, the pride mingled with grief for those he couldn't save. Beneath it lay the photographs, Marcus in uniform with his squad, Marcus with his mother at his basic training graduation, before cancer took her, Marcus and Captain Marshall after the ambush, both bandaged but alive. He traced the edges of the medal, remembering who he had been before the streets claimed him. Lieutenant Marcus Washington, respected, valued, seen. Across town, Officer Brennan was facing Lieutenant Cooper's wrath in a closed-door meeting. "You pressured Patel to ID a suspect he never saw?" Cooper shouted, slamming his fist on the desk. "And now he's signed an affidavit for Judge Marshall? Do you have any idea how bad this looks?" Brennan's arrogance had faded, replaced by a defensive hostility. Patel's confused, probably intimidated by the judge's clerk showing up. "And the security footage you said was malfunctioning? Patel claims the system was working fine." "He's mistaken. Those systems go down all the time." Cooper studied Brennan with disgust. "This isn't your first problem case, Tom. Your record's littered with complaints of racial profiling, excessive force, convenient malfunctions of body cameras." "Those complaints were dismissed," Brennan snapped, "because we closed ranks, protected our own." Cooper leaned forward. "But this time you've targeted a Medal of Honor recipient who saved a federal judge's life. This isn't going away with departmental obfuscation." Brennan's face flushed with anger. "Washington's just another homeless junkie who served his country with distinction while you were still in high school," Cooper cut in. "The chief wants you on administrative leave pending investigation." "That's bullshit." "That's mercy," Cooper corrected. "Because if Judge Marshall pushes for a full investigation into your arrest patterns, you'll wish administrative leave was the worst of it." Meanwhile, at her cluttered desk, Karen Daniels was reviewing the documentation Judge Marshall had provided. Mr. Patel's affidavit was damning. He described Brennan arriving at his store, telling him a suspect had been apprehended, and pressuring him to sign a statement despite Patel's insistence that he couldn't identify the robber. More troubling was Patel's claim that when he mentioned the security system, Brennan had told him not to worry about it, that his statement was enough. The next day, Patel found the security equipment had been tampered with, the footage from that night missing. Karen's phone rang, a colleague at the public defender's office. "Karen, that background check you requested on Officer Brennan came through. It's enlightening." "Tell me," she said, grabbing a pen. 5 excessive force complaints in 3 years, all involving minorities. 3 allegations of evidence tampering. Nothing stuck because the department's internal investigations cleared him each time. What about arrest patterns? That's where it gets interesting. He has an unusually high rate of arrests for suspects matching descriptions who turn out to be uninvolved, predominantly Black and Hispanic men. Karen scribbled notes furiously. "Anything else?" "Yeah, one more thing. Brennan and Judge Marshall have history. Before Marshall was appointed to the federal bench, he was a prosecutor. He tried a case where Brennan's testimony was essential, a drug bust that went sideways. Marshall lost when defense counsel exposed inconsistencies in Brennan's account." "So Brennan has a grudge against Marshall," Karen mused. "That adds another layer." "Be careful, Karen. Brennan has friends in the department. This case is getting attention from people who prefer certain things stay hidden." After hanging up, Karen opened her laptop to draft a motion to dismiss based on prosecutorial misconduct. The case against Marcus was unraveling, but she felt no triumph, only anger at how easily the system had accepted Brennan's word over a homeless veteran's truth. At exactly 3 o'clock, Marcus arrived at her office, his backpack securely fastened, his posture more confident than she'd seen before. "I met with Judge Marshall's clerk," he said without preamble. "Gave a formal statement about my whereabouts the night of the robbery. 3 people at the underpass confirmed seeing me there all evening." Karen smiled. "That's excellent. With Patel's affidavit and these witnesses, Collins has no case. Unless she produces the security footage that supposedly doesn't exist, Marcus noted. About that, Karen hesitated. I've been doing some digging. There's a pattern with Brennan. Evidence that should exist mysteriously doesn't when it might contradict his version of events. Marcus nodded, unsurprised. Men like Brennan exist everywhere. Saw them in the military too. The ones who abuse their authority because the uniform gives them cover. The difference is, this time he targeted someone with a powerful ally. Karen gathered her files. Judge Marshall is taking a significant risk by not recusing himself. His reputation, possibly even his position, could be compromised. Marshall understands duty, Marcus said simply. Some debts can't be repaid with words alone. As the sun began its descent over Westfield, casting long shadows across the courthouse square, two men prepared for the battle ahead. In his chambers, Judge Robert Marshall reviewed the confidential file his friend had delivered, a comprehensive account of Officer Brennan's career, including incidents never formally reported. In his motel room, Marcus Washington stood before the mirror, practicing the testimony he might need to give, determined to face the court with the same courage he'd shown on the battlefield. Both men understood what was at stake. Not just Marcus's freedom, but the integrity of a system that too often failed those it claimed to protect. Courtroom 3A hummed with unusual energy the following morning. Word had spread about the evidentiary hearing, attracting local media, curious attorneys, and community members. The presence of several uniformed officers along the back wall suggested the police department was watching closely. Marcus sat beside Karen at the defense table, wearing clothes she had helped him purchase, a simple button-down shirt and pressed slacks that restored some of his dignity. The medal rested in his pocket, a talisman of who he truly was beneath the labels society had assigned him. Judge Marshall entered precisely at 9, his robe flowing behind him like a general's cloak. The gallery rose, then settled as he took his seat. This hearing will determine whether sufficient evidence exists to proceed with charges against Mr. Washington, Marshall began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Ms. Collins, call your first witness. The prosecutor stood, her confidence visibly diminished from the previous day. The people call Mr. Vikram Patel. The store owner approached the stand, a slight man with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. After being sworn in, he glanced nervously around the courtroom, his eyes briefly meeting Marcus's before darting away. Mr. Patel, Collins began, please describe what happened the night of December 12th at your store. Patel clasped his hands to stop their trembling. It was approximately 8:15 p.m. I was restocking behind the counter when a man entered wearing a hood. He approached the register and demanded money. Did you get a clear look at this man? Patel hesitated. No. His face was obscured by the hood and a scarf. I could not identify his features clearly. Collins frowned. In your initial statement to Officer Brennan, you indicated the suspect was a black male, approximately 50 years old, wearing military-style clothing. Officer Brennan suggested those details, Patel replied, his accent thickening with stress. He said they had apprehended someone matching that description and asked if it sounded correct. I felt pressured to agree. Objection, Collins interjected. The witness is impugning an officer's integrity without evidence. It's his sworn testimony about his own experience, Marshall responded evenly. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Patel. Patel described how he had handed over approximately $200 from the register before the robber fled. When Officer Brennan arrived 20 minutes later, he had already developed a theory about the suspect. When I mentioned our security cameras, Officer Brennan said they would check the footage later, but first needed my statement identifying the suspect. And did you identify anyone? Karen asked during her cross-examination. No, I told him I could not see the face clearly. but he brought me a photo of Mr. Washington the next day, saying he was the primary suspect and needed me to confirm. Did you confirm? I said the general build was similar, but I could not be certain. Officer Brennan wrote in his report that I had positively identified the suspect. Patel's voice quavered. This was not true. Judge Marshall leaned forward. Mr. Patel, what happened to your security footage? The next morning I found the recording device had been unplugged. The footage from that evening was gone. And you reported this to whom? I called the police station, spoke to a detective. He said sometimes equipment malfunctions during investigations, not to worry about it. Marshall's expression darkened. Thank you, Mr. Patel. You may step down. He turned to Collins. Call your next witness. The people call Officer Thomas Brennan. Brennan strode to the stand with practiced confidence, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed his tension. After being sworn in, he sat with the easy posture of someone accustomed to testifying. Officer Brennan, Collins began, clearly trying to salvage her case. Please explain how Mr. Washington became a suspect in this robbery. I received a call about a disturbance at the underpass near Westfield Plaza. While responding, a robbery was reported at Patel's convenience just 3 blocks away. The description matched the individual I'd been sent to check on. And that individual was? Marcus Washington, homeless man known to frequent the area. When I found him, he had a $20 bill that appeared to have come from the robbery and was carrying a knife that could have been used to threaten Mr. Patel. Karen's objection was immediate. Your Honor, the witness is presenting conclusions, not facts. The $20 hasn't been linked to the robbery, and the pocket knife is legal to carry. Sustained, Marshall ruled. Officer Brennan, stick to factual observations. Brennan's jawline hardened. When I approached Washington, he was evasive and uncooperative. Defendant's demeanor is not evidence of criminal activity, Marshall noted. Ms. Collins, do you have any actual evidence linking Mr. Washington to this crime? Collins hesitated. Your Honor, we have the defendant's presence near the scene, possession of cash consistent with proceeds from the robbery, and a potential weapon. What you have, Marshall corrected, is a man existing in public space, possessing a legal amount of currency and a legal pocket knife. Nothing that establishes probable cause, let alone proof beyond reasonable doubt. The investigation is ongoing. The investigation appears compromised from the start, Marshall interrupted. Officer Brennan, did you attempt to locate and preserve the security footage from Mr. Patel's store? Brennan's confidence faltered slightly. The system was reported as malfunctioning. Reported by whom? I received that information from Mr. Patel. Marshall's gaze intensified. That directly contradicts Mr. Patel's testimony under oath. He states he told you the system was operational and that you dismissed its importance. He must be confused. Language barrier, perhaps. Mr. Patel's English seems perfectly adequate to this court, Marshall observed dryly. Officer Brennan, are you aware of the penalties for tampering with evidence? Before Brennan could respond, the courtroom doors opened. Lieutenant Cooper entered, accompanied by a tech-savvy officer carrying a laptop. Cooper approached the bench, speaking quietly to Judge Marshall. After a brief conference, Marshall addressed the courtroom. It appears we have a development. Lieutenant Cooper has recovered security footage from the night in question from the cloud backup of Mr. Patel's system. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Brennan's face drained of color. Your Honor, Cooper explained, our department's IT specialist discovered the local recordings were deleted, but the system automatically uploads to secure cloud storage every 12 hours. We've retrieved the relevant time frame. Marshall ordered the courtroom's audio-visual system prepared. As the technician connected the laptop, Marcus leaned toward Karen. Is this normal procedure? He whispered. Not even close, she replied. Cooper must have been investigating independently. The lights dimmed, and grainy footage appeared on the screen. The timestamp showed 8:17 p.m. on December 12th, the night of the robbery. A hooded figure entered the frame, approaching the counter. Though the face remained obscured, one thing was immediately apparent. The person was significantly shorter and slighter than Marcus Washington. More telling was the timestamp on the bottom corner, 8:17 p.m. According to Brennan's report, he had encountered Marcus at the underpass at 8:05 p.m., 12 minutes before the robbery occurred. The gallery erupted in whispers as the footage continued, showing the robber fleeing at 8:19 p.m. Judge Marshall gavelled for order. "Officer Brennan," he addressed the increasingly uncomfortable witness, "would you care to explain how Mr. Washington could have committed this robbery when your own report places him under your observation at the time it occurred?" Brennan's composure cracked. The timestamp could be wrong. Systems malfunction. "The timestamp corresponds exactly with Mr. Patel's report of when the incident occurred," Marshall countered. "Lieutenant Cooper, has the integrity of this footage been verified?" "Yes, Your Honor. Our technical unit confirmed it hasn't been altered." Marshall turned to Collins. "Ms. Collins, does the prosecution wish to continue pursuing charges against Mr. Washington in light of this evidence?" The prosecutor stood, professional enough to recognize a lost cause. "No, Your Honor. The people move to dismiss all charges against Marcus Washington." "Motion granted," Marshall declared, his gavel striking with finality. "Mr. Washington, you are free to go. This court apologizes for the ordeal you've endured." The formality of the dismissal couldn't contain the emotion that surged through the courtroom. Several spectators applauded. A reporter rushed out to break the story. Officer Brennan sat frozen on the witness stand, watching his career implode. "Furthermore," Marshall continued, "I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for investigation into possible charges of evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and filing false reports against Officer Brennan." As the courtroom began to clear, Marcus remained seated, momentarily overwhelmed. The system that had so often failed him had finally worked, not because of its inherent fairness, but because of individuals who chose integrity over expediency. Judge Marshall stepped down from the bench, pausing near the defense table. Though judicial ethics prevented him from speaking directly to Marcus in this setting, their eyes met briefly, soldier to soldier, a silent acknowledgement of battles survived together. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Karen fielded most questions professionally, emphasizing the importance of due process and the dangers of prosecutorial overreach. Marcus stood quietly beside her, his medal now pinned to his shirt pocket where all could see it, no longer hidden, no longer ashamed. As cameras flashed around him, Marcus Washington began the long process of reclaiming not just his freedom, but his identity. The homeless veteran label would no longer be the sum total of who he was in the public's perception. The truth had been revealed, not just about his innocence, but about his worth. The media storm that followed Marcus's exoneration transformed him from an invisible man to a reluctant local celebrity. His story, decorated veteran wrongfully accused, saved by the judge whose life he once rescued, was irresistible to news outlets. Within hours, the narrative had spread beyond Westfield to national platforms, where it ignited discussions about police accountability, veteran homelessness, and the failings of the justice system. Marcus retreated to his motel room, overwhelmed by the attention. The manager, who had watched the news coverage, approached him that evening. "Mr. Washington," he said, knocking tentatively. "Some reporters are asking for you in the lobby. I told them I couldn't confirm you were staying here." "Thank you," Marcus replied, grateful for the small protection of privacy. "Also," the manager continued, "your room is covered for another week. Someone called to extend your stay. Wouldn't give a name, just said it was handled." After the manager left, Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his medal. The unexpected kindness touched him deeply, though he suspected Karen Daniels was behind it. The extension gave him breathing room to figure out next steps, but the fundamental reality remained unchanged. He was still homeless, still struggling with PTSD, still disconnected from the support systems most people took for granted. His phone rang, a basic model Karen had provided so they could communicate about the case. Now that the case was dismissed, he wondered if he should return it. "Marcus, it's Karen. How are you holding up?" "Managing," he answered truthfully. "Thank you for extending my room." A pause. "That wasn't me, though I wish I'd thought of it. Listen, there's something you should know. The story's gone viral. I've received calls from veterans advocacy groups, housing organizations, even a few law firms interested in helping you file a civil suit against the department." Marcus frowned. "I'm not looking to profit from this." "This isn't about profit," Karen insisted. "It's about accountability and ensuring you have the resources to rebuild your life. Officer Brennan's actions cost you weeks of freedom and could have cost you years. There's a clear case for damages." Before Marcus could respond, she continued, "I'm not asking you to decide now. Just think about it. In the meantime, a representative from the Veterans Justice Outreach Program contacted me. They want to meet with you tomorrow to discuss housing and healthcare options." After hanging up, Marcus turned on the television, curious despite himself about how his story was being portrayed. Most coverage was sympathetic, highlighting his military service and the injustice he'd faced. Some outlets focused on Judge Marshall's potential ethics violation in not recusing himself, though legal experts generally defended his handling of the case, given the evidence of police misconduct. What troubled Marcus was seeing his life reduced to convenient narrative points: the heroic soldier fallen on hard times, the victim of a broken system. The complexity of his struggles with PTSD, the daily battle to maintain dignity while homeless, the small kindnesses and crushing rejections that had shaped his existence. None of that translated to sound bites. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Thomas Brennan faced the consequences of his actions in Chief Edwards' office. "Effective immediately, you're suspended without pay pending internal investigation," Edwards informed him, ice in his voice. "Your badge and service weapon, please." Brennan complied, his movements stiff with suppressed rage. "This is a railroad job. Marshall had it in for me from the start." "Marshall exposed what appears to be a pattern of misconduct that we should have caught," Edwards corrected. "The DA's office is reviewing every case you've been involved with. Lieutenant Cooper has already identified 3 additional incidents where evidence may have been mishandled." "Cooper's gunning for my job," Brennan spat. "Cooper's doing his job," Edwards countered. "Which is more than I can say for you. The department's facing a PR nightmare, not to mention potential civil litigation that could cost taxpayers millions. Washington's just a homeless." "Finish that sentence, and I'll add insubordination to the charges," Edwards cut in sharply. "That homeless man is a Medal of Honor recipient who served his country with distinction. More importantly, he's a citizen entitled to due process, which you apparently decided to circumvent." After Brennan stormed out, Edwards buzzed his secretary. "Get me Judge Marshall's office." At his home that evening, Judge Robert Marshall sat in his study reviewing the day's events. The phone call from Chief Edwards had been unexpected, a professional courtesy to inform him that the police department was conducting a thorough internal investigation into not just Brennan's conduct, but potential systemic issues that allowed it to continue unchecked. Marshall suspected the chief's sudden commitment to transparency had more to do with damage control than justice, but he welcomed it nonetheless. The system worked only when those within it held each other accountable. His judicial assistant had compiled a thick folder of media coverage, flagging several articles questioning his decision not to recuse himself. The Judicial Ethics Committee would likely review the matter, though Marshall was confident his actions would be vindicated given the extraordinary circumstances and the evidence of Officer Brennan's misconduct. What troubled him more was the unfinished business with Marcus Washington. The dismissal of charges, while necessary, did nothing to address the underlying issues that had led a decorated veteran to live beneath an underpass. The debt Marshall owed couldn't be repaid merely by ensuring justice in a single case. His doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. Few people knew his home address, and fewer still would visit unannounced. Through the security camera, he recognized Karen Daniels standing on his porch, briefcase in hand. "Ms. Daniels," he greeted her, opening the door. "This is unexpected." "I apologize for the intrusion, Your Honor," she replied formally, aware they were still bound by professional protocols despite the unusual circumstances. "May I have a moment of your time?" Marshall led her to his study, curious about what would prompt this unorthodox visit. Once seated, Karen opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder. "I've been approached by several organizations interested in helping Marcus Washington. Before proceeding, I wanted to ensure there wouldn't be any appearance of impropriety given your connection to the case." Marshall nodded, appreciating her caution. "The case is dismissed. My official involvement has concluded. What organizations?" "The Veterans Justice Outreach Program, for starters. They're prepared to fast-track him for housing assistance and comprehensive health care. Then there's the Military Honor Foundation. They're interested in featuring his story and providing financial support. And you're concerned about my involvement because your history with Marcus complicates matters. The media's already speculating about whether your intervention was appropriate. If you're seen to be orchestrating benefits for him now, it could feed those concerns." Marshall considered this. "You're right to be cautious, Ms. Daniels. However, there's a distinction between my judicial role, which is concluded, and my personal capacity as a veteran who shares history with Mr. Washington." "So you are planning to help him?" "I'm planning to repay a debt," Marshall corrected. "But I take your point about appearances. Perhaps we can find a balance that respects both ethical boundaries and moral obligations." Karen studied him thoughtfully. "Marcus isn't looking for charity. He's proud, maybe to a fault. What he needs is opportunity, not handouts." "I understand that better than you might think," Marshall replied. "We soldiers don't easily accept help, even when we need it most." The conversation shifted to practical matters: how to connect Marcus with resources without undermining his dignity or creating ethical complications. By the time Karen left, they had outlined a framework that respected all boundaries while still offering real assistance. As Marshall showed her out, she paused at the door. "You know, when this case first landed on my desk, I thought it was just another homeless defendant being railroaded through the system. I never imagined it would expose so much. About the police department, about the failures of our veterans' services, about how easily we look away from those we should be protecting. Sometimes it takes one case to illuminate larger truths," Marshall observed. "The question is whether we'll learn from them or return to comfortable blindness once the media moves on." That night, as Marcus Washington drifted into an uneasy sleep in his motel room, the wheels of change had already begun turning. Across town, Judge Marshall made several phone calls to former military colleagues now in positions of influence. Karen Daniels stayed late at her office, drafting documents for a potential civil rights case. Lieutenant Cooper continued reviewing Officer Brennan's past arrests, building a case that went beyond a single incident of misconduct. And in newsrooms across the country, producers shaped the story of a homeless veteran, a corrupt officer, and a judge bound by an old debt, simplifying complexity into digestible narratives, but also shining light on issues too long relegated to society's shadows. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the Veterans Affairs Office as Marcus sat across from Sarah Ramirez, a Veterans Justice Outreach specialist. Her desk was organized chaos, files stacked in precise order, post-it notes creating a mosaic of reminders, and framed photographs of military units suggesting her own service history. "Your case has created quite a stir, Mr. Washington," she said, reviewing his file. "It's unfortunate that it took something this dramatic to get you the attention you should have received years ago." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, still unaccustomed to being treated with respect after years of invisibility. "I'm not looking for special treatment." "This isn't special treatment," Sarah corrected firmly. "This is the standard of care every veteran deserves but too few receive due to bureaucratic obstacles and resource limitations." She tapped her computer screen. "According to your records, you've been eligible for HUD-VASH housing vouchers and comprehensive health care all along. The question is why these services weren't properly coordinated when you first experienced homelessness." The answer hung unspoken between them. A system overwhelmed by need, understaffed and underfunded, where veterans like Marcus fell through widening cracks despite their sacrifice. "Here's what we can do immediately," Sarah continued, "all business. Fast-track your housing voucher so you can secure permanent accommodation. Schedule comprehensive medical and psychological evaluations to update your VA disability rating, which, frankly, appears to have been underassessed. Connect you with vocational rehabilitation services if you're interested in employment." Marcus's military mind appreciated her methodical approach. "How long will all this take?" "Normally, months. Given the circumstances and the spotlight on your case, weeks, possibly days for some components." She met his eyes directly. "I won't pretend this isn't partly about the department's saving face. Your story has exposed failures in the system that can't be ignored. But I promise you this: I'll be just as thorough and persistent with every veteran who comes through that door after the media moves on." For the first time in years, Marcus felt a weight lifting, not just the immediate burden of homelessness, but the crushing isolation of fighting a system designed to wear down even the most resilient souls. After scheduling follow-up appointments, Marcus walked through downtown Westfield, conscious of the changed way people looked at him. The local newspaper had published a feature that morning with his military photo alongside the headline, "Hero Veteran Vindicated." Some passers-by now nodded respectfully where they once averted their eyes. Others seemed almost embarrassed, perhaps recognizing him as someone they had previously ignored or avoided. The Veterans Services meeting had restored some of his hope, but Marcus knew that systemic problems couldn't be solved with a few appointments. The thousands of other veterans sleeping on streets across America wouldn't benefit from media attention or connections to federal judges. His phone rang, the Veterans Justice Outreach Office calling with unexpected news. An apartment had become available in a veterans housing complex. Given his case's urgency, they were offering it to him immediately if he wanted to view it. Across town at the police department, Lieutenant Cooper was conducting interviews with officers who had worked closely with Brennan over the years. The investigation had expanded beyond a single case of misconduct to examine potential patterns of abuse and cover-ups. "Officer Reynolds," Cooper addressed the young policeman who had been Brennan's partner the night of Marcus's arrest. "Your incident report differs in several details from Officer Brennan's. Can you explain the discrepancies?" Reynolds fidgeted nervously. "I was still in training. Officer Brennan said it was standard to let the senior officer handle the paperwork." "But you signed off on his report," Cooper pressed. "A report that claimed Mr. Washington was belligerent and uncooperative, when your body camera footage shows him being calm and compliant." "I felt pressured," Reynolds admitted, his voice barely audible. "Brennan said rookies who made waves didn't last long in this department." Cooper leaned forward. "How many other reports have you signed that contained inaccuracies?" The young officer's expression crumbled. "Several, mostly involving homeless individuals or minorities. Brennan said nobody would care enough to check, and the paperwork would move through the system faster." "Did you report these concerns to anyone?" Reynolds stared at his hands. I tried talking to Sergeant Miller once. He told me to learn the ropes and stop being naive. Cooper made a note. Sergeant Miller had just been added to the investigation's expanding scope. In her office downtown, Karen Daniels was on a conference call with civil rights attorneys from the Equal Justice Initiative. The Marshall case, as it was now being called, had potential to become a landmark in addressing police misconduct toward vulnerable populations. "We're prepared to take this case pro bono," the lead attorney explained. Mr. Washington's situation highlights intersectional issues of racial profiling, veteran neglect, and criminalization of homelessness. "I appreciate the offer," Karen replied, "but Marcus is hesitant about pursuing litigation. He's concerned about being used as a symbol rather than treated as a person." "Understandable," the attorney acknowledged. "But sometimes individual cases create opportunities for systemic change. His story has resonated nationally precisely because it exposes failures across multiple institutions." After the call, Karen sat contemplating the balance between respecting Marcus's wishes and leveraging this moment to drive broader reforms. The media attention would eventually fade, but structural changes could create lasting impact. Her office door opened, revealing her supervisor, public defender, Michael Reynolds. "Just got word from the DA's office. They're reviewing every case Officer Brennan has touched in the past 5 years. Already identified 3 other defendants who may have been wrongfully convicted based on his testimony." "Any other homeless veterans?" Karen asked. "No, but 2 homeless men and 4 African-American defendants with similar patterns. Questionable evidence, contradictory witness statements, conveniently missing footage." Reynolds shook his head. "This could become the biggest police misconduct case in the city's history." In his chambers, Judge Marshall was meeting with Chief Judge Hernandez, who oversaw the federal district. "The Judicial Ethics Committee has reviewed your handling of the Washington case," Hernandez informed him. "Given the extraordinary circumstances and the evidence of officer misconduct, they've determined your decision not to immediately recuse yourself was justified." Marshall nodded, relieved but not surprised. "And going forward?" "That's trickier," Hernandez acknowledged. "Your personal connection to Washington creates an ongoing appearance of conflict that needs careful management." "I understand the ethical considerations," Marshall assured him. "But I also have a moral obligation to a man who saved my life." Hernandez leaned back, studying his colleague. "I'm not here to discourage that. Just to ensure whatever assistance you provide remains above reproach. The last thing either of you needs is allegations that your judicial authority was leveraged inappropriately." "I've been giving this considerable thought," Marshall said. "I've established a blind trust to contribute to a Veterans Assistance Fund. The administrators have complete discretion over disbursements, with no input from me." "A prudent approach," Hernandez approved. "And your personal involvement?" "Will be as one veteran supporting another, with transparent boundaries and no connection to my judicial role." That evening, Marcus stood in a small but clean 1-bedroom apartment in the Veterans Housing Complex. Sunlight slanted through windows that overlooked a courtyard garden. The space was basic but dignified, a world away from the underpass where he'd spent countless nights. "It's yours if you want it," the housing coordinator explained. "Rent will be mostly covered by your voucher, with a minimal contribution based on your income once you're stabilized." Marcus moved through the space slowly, touching the walls, opening cabinets, testing the shower's water pressure. After years of having no private space, the prospect of 4 walls and a roof belonging exclusively to him felt almost overwhelming. "There's a veterans support group that meets in the community room twice weekly," the coordinator continued. "Participation is voluntary but encouraged. Many residents find it helpful for the transition." Transition. The word carried weight. This wasn't just a change in living situation, but a potential bridge back to the life he'd lost. or perhaps to a new life altogether. As Marcus signed the preliminary paperwork, his phone rang again. Karen Daniels was calling with more news. "Marcus, I just heard from Mr. Patel, the convenience store owner. He wants to meet with you, says he feels terrible about what happened and wants to make amends personally." The pieces were falling into place with dizzying speed. After years of stagnation, of fighting just to survive each day, Marcus found himself at the center of a whirlwind of change. The challenge now was maintaining his balance, his identity, his agency in a narrative that threatened to sweep him along like a leaf in a current. That night, in his motel room, the last night before moving to his new apartment, Marcus placed his Medal of Honor on the bedside table where he could see it. The medal had accompanied him through homelessness, through arrest, through vindication. It had been both burden and blessing, a reminder of who he had been and who he might become again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: furnishing an apartment, navigating medical appointments, deciding whether to pursue legal action against the department, managing newfound public recognition. But for now, for this moment, Marcus Washington allowed himself to feel something he had almost forgotten: hope. Marcus stood in the center of his new apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes containing donated furnishings and household essentials. The Veterans Support Network had mobilized quickly, transforming the empty space into something approaching a home. A bed frame and mattress dominated the bedroom. The kitchenette boasted basic cookware and dishes. The small living room held a second-hand couch and coffee table. None of it matched, all of it was functional, and to Marcus it represented wealth beyond measure. "Need help unpacking anything else?" asked Jeff Simmons, a volunteer from the local VFW who had coordinated the donations and helped with the move. Marcus shook his head, still processing the sudden shift in his circumstances. "You've done more than enough. Thank you." After Jeff left, Marcus sat on the edge of the bed, running his hand over the clean sheets. For 7 years he had slept in shelters when lucky, beneath underpasses or in alleyways when not. The softness beneath his fingers seemed almost unreal, as did the privacy, the shower with reliable hot water, the refrigerator humming quietly in the kitchen. His phone chimed with a text message from Karen. "Meeting with Mr. Patel set for 2 p.m. at his store. I can drive you if needed." Marcus replied that he would walk. The store was only a mile from his new apartment, and the exercise would help clear his mind. The prospect of facing the man whose mistaken identification had led to his arrest stirred complex emotions. There was no anger. Marcus understood how pressure from authority figures could override one's better judgment. But there was apprehension about revisiting the place where his ordeal had begun. Meanwhile, at the police department, Chief Edwards was holding a press conference addressing the expanding investigation into Officer Brennan and potential systemic issues within the force. "We are conducting a thorough review of all arrests and evidence handling procedures," Edwards announced to the assembled reporters. "Officer Brennan remains suspended pending the outcome of internal and criminal investigations. Additionally, Sergeant Miller has been placed on administrative leave as we examine his supervisory role." A reporter raised her hand. "Chief Edwards, sources suggest Officer Brennan's conduct was part of a pattern known to department leadership. How do you respond to allegations of institutional cover-up?" Edwards' expression tightened. "I reject any characterization that department leadership knowingly condoned misconduct. However, we are examining whether warning signs were missed or complaints inadequately investigated." "Will there be independent oversight of this investigation?" another reporter pressed. "Yes. The mayor has authorized the formation of a civilian review panel, and we've requested assistance from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division to ensure complete transparency." Across town, Lieutenant Cooper interviewed Sergeant Miller, whose defensive posture suggested he understood the jeopardy he faced. "Officer Reynolds states he raised concerns about Brennan's report-writing practices with you on multiple occasions," Cooper said, sliding transcripts across the desk. Miller's expression hardened. Reynolds is a rookie trying to save his own skin. He's exaggerating casual conversations. We have similar statements from 3 other junior officers, Cooper countered. All report bringing concerns to you about Brennan's conduct, particularly regarding interactions with homeless individuals and minorities. All say you dismiss these concerns. I advise them to focus on learning their jobs, Miller insisted. The streets aren't the academy. Sometimes reports need streamlining to move cases through an overloaded system. Streamlining is one thing. Fabrication is another. Cooper leaned forward. Did you review the body camera footage from Washington's arrest before approving Brennan's report? Miller's silence was damning. At precisely 2 p.m., Marcus arrived at Patel's convenience store. The small bell above the door announced his entrance, causing Mr. Patel to look up from behind the counter. Recognition flashed in his eyes, followed by a complex mix of emotions: guilt, relief, concern. Mr. Washington, Patel said, coming around the counter, thank you for coming. Please, my office is in back. The small office was cramped but orderly. Patel gestured to a chair before taking his own seat, hands clasped tightly on the desk. I am deeply sorry for what happened, he began, his voice strained. When Officer Brennan showed me your photograph, I told him I could not be certain. He made it seem as though identifying you was a formality, that other evidence already confirmed your guilt. Marcus nodded, understanding the pressure Patel had faced. You came forward with the truth when it mattered most. That took courage. Patel seemed surprised by the lack of recrimination. Still, you suffered because I was not strong enough to resist pressure. We were both caught in something bigger than ourselves, Marcus observed, a system that valued convenience over truth. Their conversation continued, 2 men from different worlds finding common ground in their experiences of vulnerability before authority. Before Marcus left, Patel insisted on giving him a bag of groceries for his new apartment, refusing any payment. It was a small gesture of restitution, but the humanity behind it touched Marcus deeply. As he walked home, groceries in hand, Marcus noticed a familiar car slowing beside him. The window rolled down, revealing Judge Marshall in casual clothes, the first time Marcus had seen him out of uniform or robes. Need a ride, Lieutenant? Marshall asked, using Marcus's military rank. After a moment's hesitation, Marcus got in. The groceries rested between them like a buffer. I was in the neighborhood for a meeting, Marshall explained, though both men knew the encounter wasn't coincidental. Heard you moved into Veterans Village. Yesterday, Marcus confirmed. Still getting settled. Marshall drove slowly, taking a circuitous route that suggested he wanted time to talk. I've been thinking about our time in Afghanistan, the men we lost, the ones we saved. Marcus remained silent, sensing more was coming. When I returned home, I had a support system, family, colleagues, resources. You came back to what? My mother had passed while I was deployed, Marcus replied. No siblings, few close friends. The transition was challenging. Marshall nodded, understanding the understatement. The system failed you. I failed you too. I should have stayed in contact, made sure you were getting what you needed. With respect, sir, my situation wasn't your responsibility. Wasn't it? Marshall glanced at him. In the field, we lived by leave no man behind. That principle shouldn't end when the uniform comes off. They arrived at Marcus's apartment building. Marshall put the car in park but made no move to exit. I can't directly involve myself in your civil case or VA benefits, he said carefully. Ethical boundaries. But I've been working with veteran advocacy groups to establish a better support network for returning service members. Your experience, what worked, what didn't, where the system broke down, would be invaluable. Marcus considered the offer. You're asking me to turn my ordeal into policy recommendations? I'm asking you to help ensure no other veteran ends up living under an underpass after serving their country, Marshall corrected. The choice is entirely yours. You've already given more than most. Before Marcus could respond, his phone rang. Karen Daniels calling with news. Marcus, the district attorney just announced they're reopening 27 cases involving Officer Brennan. 3 people have already been released from custody pending review. They're calling it the Washington Review Protocol, examining cases with similar patterns of evidence handling. The implications settled over him as he thanked her and hung up. His individual case had catalyzed something larger, a reckoning that might bring justice to others who lacked his sudden visibility. Marshall, who had heard Marcus's side of the conversation, nodded solemnly. Sometimes it takes one case to expose the cracks in the foundation. The question now is whether we'll truly rebuild or just apply cosmetic repairs until the next collapse. As Marcus gathered his groceries to exit the car, Marshall added, "Whatever you decide about the advocacy work, I'd like to invite you to dinner next week. Not as judge and defendant, not as captain and lieutenant, just as 2 veterans who shared a foxhole once." The invitation hung between them, an offering of equality, of respect, of recognition that transcended their divergent paths since Afghanistan. "I'd like that," Marcus said finally. That evening in his new apartment, Marcus prepared a simple meal on his own stove for the first time in years. The routine domestic acts, chopping vegetables, measuring rice, setting a proper plate on the small table, felt like reclaiming pieces of his humanity that homelessness had stripped away. As he ate, he reflected on the day's conversations, with Patel, who had found the courage to admit his mistake and seek amends, with Marshall, who acknowledged his own failure of responsibility while offering a path forward, with Karen, whose call had illuminated how his individual case was rippling outward to affect others. The apartment was quiet, except for the occasional sounds of neighbors, footsteps above, muffled voices through walls. After years of the chaotic noise of streets and shelters, the ordinary sounds of communal living felt almost sacred. Marcus Washington was no longer invisible, no longer merely a statistic or cautionary tale. The medal that had accompanied him through years of hardship now sat prominently on his bedside table, no longer hidden away like a secret or shame. He was being seen, truly seen, perhaps for the first time since returning from war. The challenge now was seeing himself clearly after years of having his identity obscured by labels: homeless, veteran, defendant, victim. Beneath all those designations was a man still figuring out who he could become in this unexpected second chance. 1 week later, Marcus stood before his bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of a new button-down shirt. The Veterans Support Network had provided him with several sets of clothing, simple, dignified attire that fit properly, unlike the donated items he'd occasionally received at shelters. Tonight's dinner with Judge Marshall felt significant, a crossing of boundaries that had defined their relationship since that day in Afghanistan. His phone chimed with a text from Karen. "Great news. DA's office just announced formal charges against Brennan. Evidence tampering, witness intimidation, filing false reports. Miller charged as accessory. Call me when you can." The news settled over Marcus with complicated emotions. There was no satisfaction in seeing careers destroyed, only a somber recognition that accountability was necessary for healing, both individual and institutional. A knock at his door announced Marshall's arrival. The judge had insisted on picking him up rather than meeting at the restaurant, perhaps understanding that Marcus might feel uncomfortable in upscale surroundings after years on the streets. "You're looking well," Marshall observed as they drove. Gone was the formal judicial demeanor, replaced by the more direct manner of a military officer. "VA healthcare has its advantages," Marcus replied. "Finally got the medication adjusted. Sleeping better." They arrived at a small, unassuming restaurant on the outskirts of town, neither too fancy nor too casual, a neutral ground where both could feel comfortable. Once seated in a quiet corner booth, the initial awkwardness began to dissolve. "I heard about the charges against Brennan and Miller," Marshall said after they'd ordered. Marcus nodded. "Karen texted me. Seems like the investigation keeps expanding. Cooper's thorough. He's identified at least 30 cases with similar patterns of misconduct. The department's facing a reckoning long overdue." Marshall paused. "How do you feel about it?" The question was asked with genuine interest, not the clinical detachment of authorities who had previously processed Marcus through various systems. "Conflicted," Marcus admitted. "I never wanted to be the catalyst for this kind of upheaval. But if it prevents others from experiencing what I did..." "That's the hope," Marshall agreed. "Though systems resist change, even when it's desperately needed." He studied Marcus carefully. "You've been through more than most could endure. Yet here you are, resilient, thoughtful, still concerned with justice rather than vengeance." Their conversation shifted to Afghanistan, to shared memories of men they'd served with, some who hadn't returned. For the first time they spoke as equals, two veterans processing experiences that had shaped them in profound ways. "When did the PTSD symptoms start?" Marshall asked eventually, the directness of a fellow soldier replacing the cautious questions of civilians. "During deployment, though I didn't recognize them then," Marcus answered. "Hypervigilance, insomnia, we all had those. After discharge, they intensified. Nightmares, flashbacks. The VA prescribed medications that left me foggy, disconnected. Started self-medicating with alcohol. Lost my job, then my apartment. The spiral happens faster than you'd think." Marshall nodded, understanding. "The system is designed for those with support networks, stable housing, reliable transportation. The very things that disappear first when veterans struggle." "Exactly. Miss one appointment because you can't find transportation, you're labeled non-compliant. Documentation gets lost when you have no fixed address. Each obstacle compounds the next until you're trapped in a cycle that seems impossible to break." Their meals arrived, momentarily pausing the conversation. Marcus noticed Marshall's careful observation as he methodically arranged his silverware, a habit formed during years of military precision that even homelessness hadn't erased. "Have you considered the advocacy work I mentioned?" Marshall asked eventually. "Still thinking about it," Marcus replied. "Part of me wants to move forward, not dwell in the past. Another part recognizes that my experience might help prevent others from falling through the same cracks. For what it's worth, your perspective would be invaluable. The people designing these programs rarely understand the practical barriers veterans face." As they continued talking, Marcus found himself sharing details of his experience he'd never articulated before. The particular humiliations of homelessness, the invisibility that became a kind of prison, the ways survival consumed all energy that might otherwise go toward recovery. Marshall listened with the focus of someone who understood both military precision and judicial evaluation of evidence, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated genuine comprehension. "What would have made the biggest difference?" he asked as they finished their meals. "If you could redesign the system, where would you start?" Marcus considered the question seriously. Continuity of care. Having one person responsible for coordinating services instead of fragmented systems that don't communicate. Housing first, without preconditions of sobriety or medication compliance. Recognition that recovery isn't linear. Setbacks happen and shouldn't result in program expulsion. "That's exactly the kind of insight the advisory board needs," Marshall noted. "People who've lived it rather than just studied it." As they drove back to Marcus's apartment, the judge shared news of his own. "The Judicial Ethics Committee completed their review. They've determined my handling of your case was appropriate given the extraordinary circumstances, though they've recommended I recuse myself from any future matters involving Brennan or the department's internal investigation. Seems reasonable, Marcus observed. Yes, though it doesn't end there. The publicity has led to increased scrutiny of how our courts handle cases involving veterans, homeless defendants, and allegations of police misconduct. The chief judge has asked me to lead a judicial training program on these issues. Marcus caught the irony. So your potential ethical violation is now becoming official judicial policy? Marshall smiled slightly. Sometimes systems change only when forced to confront their contradictions. When they reached the apartment building, Marshall turned to Marcus with unexpected solemnity. I want to say something that should have been said years ago. I'm sorry I lost track of you after we returned stateside. The debt I owe you isn't just for saving my life in that burning Humvee. It's for the example you set every day in that hellhole, your integrity, your compassion for civilians, your steady leadership when everything was falling apart around us. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Marcus felt a tightness in his throat. We all did what was necessary, he said finally. What the mission required. The mission continues, Marshall replied simply. Different terrain, different enemies, but the same fundamental purpose: to protect those who can't protect themselves, to uphold principles larger than our individual concerns. He extended his hand. I failed that mission once by losing sight of a fellow soldier. I won't make that mistake again. As they shook hands, the gesture bridged the years and circumstances that had separated them, from the dust of Afghanistan to the sterile courtroom to this moment of mutual recognition. The following morning, Marcus attended his first meeting of the Veterans Support Group in the community room of his building. 12 men and women of varying ages sat in a circle, each bearing visible and invisible wounds of service. The facilitator, a Vietnam veteran named Ray, welcomed Marcus warmly. We've been following your case in the news. Proud of how you've handled it. Marcus found himself uncomfortable with the attention, but as the meeting progressed, he realized these fellow veterans saw beyond the headlines to the complex reality of his experience. Their understanding came not from pity, but from shared struggles, with PTSD, with civilian reintegration, with systems designed for efficiency rather than healing. When it came his turn to speak, Marcus shared not about his recent vindication, but about his first week in proper housing. The disorientation of privacy after years without it, the challenges of relearning domestic routines, the persistent hypervigilance that made relaxation nearly impossible. Heads nodded around the circle. These were experiences they understood intimately. The hardest part, one woman who'd served in Iraq observed, is remembering you're still the same person who once led missions and saved lives. That being homeless or struggling doesn't erase who you were, or who you can be again. Her words resonated deeply with Marcus. For years, his identity had been reduced to homeless veteran, a label that acknowledged his service only as context for his current condition. The medal he'd earned had become almost an artifact from someone else's life, rather than recognition of capabilities that still existed within him. As the meeting concluded, Ray approached Marcus privately. Judge Marshall mentioned you might be interested in veteran advocacy work. I'm on the advisory board he's assembling. We could use your perspective. Marcus studied the older veteran, recognizing the purpose that animated him despite his own struggles. I've been considering it, he admitted. Still not sure I'm the right person. There is no right person, Ray replied with the wisdom of experience. Just those willing to ensure others don't fight the same battles we did after coming home. Walking back to his apartment, Marcus felt something shifting within him, a reconnection to purpose that had been missing since his discharge. His ordeal had exposed failures in multiple systems: police accountability, veteran services, judicial oversight. Perhaps his experience could now become a foundation for reform rather than merely a cautionary tale. His phone rang, Karen calling with more developments. The case continued to create ripples beyond anything he could have anticipated when fighting for his own vindication. Change was happening, however incrementally, because one homeless veteran had refused to surrender his dignity or accept injustice as inevitable. 6 months later, Marcus Washington stood at the podium in City Hall's main chamber, his military bearing evident as he addressed the newly formed Veterans Justice Task Force. The audience included city officials, police leadership, VA administrators, and community advocates, people with the power to implement the recommendations his committee had spent months developing. The gaps in our system aren't matters of intention, but of design, Marcus explained, his voice steady and authoritative. Programs created without input from those they're meant to serve inevitably fail to address real needs. Veterans experiencing homelessness face unique barriers, from PTSD triggers in crowded shelters to the impossibility of maintaining medication schedules without secure storage or consistent access to water. In the front row, Judge Marshall watched with quiet pride. The man at the podium bore little resemblance to the defendant who had stood in his courtroom half a year earlier. Marcus had transformed, not just in appearance, with his now healthy weight and professional attire, but in the renewed sense of purpose that animated him. Our recommendations aren't theoretical, Marcus continued. They're grounded in lived experience and practical realities. Housing-first approaches without sobriety prerequisites. Coordinated entry systems that require only one intake process instead of dozens. Court diversion programs specifically designed for veterans in crisis. These aren't luxuries or special treatments. They're necessary accommodations for those whose service to this country has left invisible wounds. As Marcus outlined specific policy recommendations, Karen Daniels made notes from her seat beside Marshall. The civil rights lawsuit against the police department had been settled 2 months earlier, resulting not just in compensation for Marcus, but in mandatory new training protocols, civilian oversight mechanisms, and technological safeguards to prevent evidence tampering. Officer Brennan had pleaded guilty to reduced charges, receiving probation and permanent disqualification from law enforcement. Sergeant Miller had retired early, avoiding criminal charges but losing a portion of his pension. The department's leadership had undergone significant restructuring, with Lieutenant Cooper now serving as assistant chief under a reform-minded chief imported from another jurisdiction. The systemic changes extended beyond the police department. Judge Marshall had established a specialized veterans treatment court, diverting eligible defendants from traditional criminal proceedings into rehabilitation programs. The VA had streamlined its housing voucher system and hired additional case managers specifically for homeless veterans. Local shelters had implemented new protocols for identifying and assisting former service members. Marcus concluded his presentation to enthusiastic applause. Mayor Richardson approached the podium to shake his hand and announce the city's commitment to implementing the task force recommendations within the next fiscal year. As the formal proceedings transitioned to a reception, Marcus found himself surrounded by people eager to continue the conversation, some offering support, others seeking his input on their own initiatives. The social dynamics that had once seemed impossibly complex after years of isolation now felt increasingly natural. Lieutenant Washington. The familiar voice came from behind him. Marcus turned to find Chief Edwards, who had managed to keep his position despite the scandal, though with significantly diminished authority. "Chief," Marcus acknowledged, neither warm nor hostile. "I wanted to personally apologize," Edwards said, keeping his voice low. "What happened to you under my leadership was inexcusable. The changes your case has inspired are long overdue." Marcus studied the man, recognizing the political calculation behind the gesture, but also the genuine discomfort. "Accountability isn't about apologies, Chief. It's about changed behavior and reformed systems." "Yes," Edwards agreed, humbled. "That's precisely what we're working toward." After Edwards moved on, Karen approached with a young man Marcus didn't recognize. "Marcus, this is James Taylor. He was one of the defendants whose case was overturned during the Washington Review Protocol. He wanted to meet you." The young black man extended his hand nervously. "Mr. Washington, I spent 18 months in county on a possession charge Officer Brennan manufactured. If your case hadn't exposed what was happening, I'd still be there." Marcus shook his hand firmly. "I'm glad you're free, Mr. Taylor. What are your plans now?" "Starting community college next month. Criminal justice program." Taylor smiled slightly. "Figure we need more people who understand the system from both sides." Later, as the reception wound down, Marcus found himself alone with Judge Marshall near the buffet table. "Impressive presentation," Marshall commented. "The committee couldn't have chosen a better spokesperson." "Still feels strange," Marcus admitted. 6 months ago, I was invisible to most of these people. Now they're treating my words like gospel. That's how change often happens. The right voice at the right moment makes previously ignored truths suddenly seem obvious. Marshall surveyed the room. "The question is whether the momentum continues once the spotlight fades." "That's why the implementation timeline is crucial," Marcus noted, "and the accountability metrics we built into the recommendations." They were interrupted by Mayor Richardson, who wanted to introduce Marcus to the city council president. As Marcus moved away, Marshall watched him navigate the political conversation with natural diplomacy, neither intimidated by authority nor bitter about his past treatment. After the event, Marcus walked the few blocks to his new apartment. He had moved from Veterans Village to a one-bedroom unit in a mixed-income building downtown, using part of his settlement to secure housing that positioned him closer to his growing professional commitments. The apartment reflected his evolving identity: simple but dignified furnishings, books on policy and veterans issues filling the shelves, his Medal of Honor displayed alongside photographs mapping his journey from military service through recovery. A framed news article hung near the door. "Washington Review Protocol leads to 27 overturned convictions." His phone rang as he was settling in for the evening. Ray from the Veterans Support Group. "Heard your presentation knocked it out of the park," Ray said. "Several members watched the live stream during our meeting. You've given a lot of people hope, Marcus." "It's still strange being on this side of the equation," Marcus confessed. "Sometimes I feel like I'm still that guy under the underpass, just playing a role in a better life." "That's normal," Ray assured him. "They call it imposter syndrome in clinical terms. I call it the aftershock of trauma. Takes time to recognize your own transformation as genuine." After they hung up, Marcus sat on his couch, reflecting on the day's events. His life had changed dramatically in 6 months, from homelessness to housing, from defendant to policy advisor, from isolation to community. Yet the journey wasn't complete. Some mornings he still woke reaching for his backpack, momentarily forgetting he had a secure place for his belongings. Crowds still triggered his hypervigilance. Trust remained a conscious choice rather than a natural inclination. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. He wasn't expecting visitors. Through the peephole, he saw Karen Daniels holding what appeared to be a cake. He opened the door, confused. "What's this about?" "Celebrating," she said, entering with the cake and setting it on his counter. "I just got word from the VA. Your disability rating appeal was successful. Full benefits, retroactive to your discharge date. The back pay alone is substantial." Marcus absorbed the news with characteristic composure. "That's significant." "It's life-changing," Karen corrected, finding plates in his cabinet. "Financial security, comprehensive health care, educational benefits if you want them." She paused, studying him. "You don't seem surprised." "After everything that's happened, I'm learning to expect justice occasionally prevailing," he replied with the hint of a smile. "Doesn't make it less meaningful." They shared cake and conversation. discussing next steps now that Marcus's basic needs were securely met. The settlement funds combined with VA benefits would provide stability while he determined his long-term path. After Karen left, Marcus stood at his window overlooking the city where he had once been invisible. Lights glimmered in office buildings and apartments, each representing lives intersecting in ways both mundane and profound. Somewhere below, others still struggled as he had: homeless veterans, wrongfully accused defendants, people fighting systems designed to process rather than serve them. His phone chimed with a text from Judge Marshall. Task Force recommendations approved unanimously. Implementation Committee meets next Tuesday. Your presence requested. Marcus replied his acceptance, then returned to his contemplation of the city. His individual case had created ripples that were becoming waves, challenging long-established practices and assumptions. The work was far from complete, but meaningful change had begun. On his kitchen counter sat the invitation to speak at next month's judicial conference, an opportunity to address the very judges whose decisions shaped the lives of veterans like himself. Beside it, a letter from the Veterans Administration requesting his participation in redesigning their outreach programs for homeless veterans. As darkness settled over Westfield, Marcus Washington, once invisible, now influential, recognized that his journey had come full circle. The systems that had failed him were now seeking his guidance to prevent similar failures for others. The medal that had once seemed a relic from another life now represented not just past valor, but present purpose. He was Lieutenant Marcus Washington again, not despite his experiences with homelessness and injustice, but because of them. Those years on the street, those weeks in detention, had forged a new kind of courage. The determination to ensure others wouldn't face the same battles alone. The courtroom where Judge Marshall had recognized his name had been just the beginning. The true vindication lay not in his personal redemption, but in the changes his story continued to inspire.